In 1940, Britain stood alone against Germany, Italy, and almost all of occupied Europe. It seemed that defeat was only a matter of time, but London had a plan, not just to survive, but to ultimately defeat Hitler. By the mid-1940s, Britain found itself alone against Germany, Italy, and their allies. The Axis powers had managed to capture nearly all of Europe, and Great Britain remained the last bastion of freedom on the continent. But despite the gravity of the situation, Britain had a plan for defeating Germany, even if it had to do so alone. But as long as France still stood, Britain's plan was as simple as could be. Essentially, it replicated the actions that had helped the Entente win World War I. The English Channel, as a natural barrier, provided the islands with reliable protection against ground forces, and a large naval fleet would prevent any landing on the islands. And by actively patrolling and mining the North Sea along the line from the Orkney and Shetland Islands to Norway, Britain intended to cut off all supplies to Germany. Ultimately, this would have allowed for the additional blockading of German ports, the protection of British sea lanes, and the buildup of Imperial and Dominion forces in Great Britain prior to their deployment to France. Such generally indirect participation in the war on the continent would have allowed England to gain enough time to build a proper army comparable in size to, well, at least the Italian one. The fact is that in the 1920s and 1930s, severe spending cuts led to significant reductions in military funding, and it was decided to drastically reduce the size of the army. Many still remembered the horrors of the Great War, which had ended only a couple of years earlier, and the heavy losses suffered by the British. The British did not want to send their soldiers back into the trenches, as in the previous war. So, in addition to the policy of appeasement toward Germany, it was decided to reform the army so that it would rely on tanks, guns, and artillery, rather than poor soldiers in the trenches. Everything British industry produced at the time prioritized mobility over firepower, while also conserving manpower. After the war began, Britain, as planned, moved to expand its army. The envisioned large army, consisting of about 60 to 70 divisions, would require significant combat and logistical support, and its creation would take considerable time for arming, training, and deployment. For the time being, the regular forces of the British Empire, together with their French allies, were to hold out until this large army was properly prepared, and this victorious army would arrive as soon as French and German manpower reserves were exhausted, which would ensure victory and a post-war order in which Britain could exert significant influence. However, the fall of France changed everything. Instead of the French army bearing the brunt of the German army, Britain would have to face this monster alone. German submarines operating from Atlantic and Mediterranean ports could attack British ships across much larger bodies of water, and British cities came under intense scrutiny from the Luftwaffe. Therefore, Britain had to quickly change its strategy of warfare. Otherwise, its large army would have had to fight on home soil, and the British had absolutely no desire to bring the war to their islands. Consequently, the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy received the lion's share of Britain's manpower reserves, as they represented the best means of ensuring Britain's survival while simultaneously striking at the Germans. The naval and merchant fleets required significant resources, one to hunt German submarines, and the other to deliver all necessary supplies when the submarines did sink some merchant ships. The battered British army, evacuated from Dunkirk, was to become the core of a much smaller force, just 35 divisions instead of 60. This was partially offset by the production of equipment and weapons, sufficient to arm a total of 55 divisions, and by the provision of arms and supplies to resistance groups in the occupied countries of Europe. At first glance, such a small number of field formations was further offset by a focus on providing armored vehicles and trucks. Britain ultimately had one armored division for every 2.5 infantry divisions. In the United States, for example, this ratio was 1 to 3.5, and in the German army, 1 to 8.5 infantry divisions. Infantry divisions were also very large and fully mechanized. They numbered about 18,000 men, with 4,000 trucks, whereas the Germans had 12,000 to 15,000 men and only 700 trucks, with all other supplies transported on slow and outdated horse-drawn wagons. Simply put, the emphasis was on small but well-trained forces to overcome the enemy's superior number of field divisions. That is, quality over quantity. The overall strategy was therefore long-term and inherently indirect in its approach. Resistance groups, combined with rapid amphibious and airborne assaults, scattered German forces during counterinsurgency operations, bolstering Allied morale and enhancing their capabilities in joint operations, while enemy forces suffered from constant, exhausting attacks. And when the enemy is finally weakened by the naval blockade, air attacks, and continuous partisan actions over the many years of the war, the well-trained and massive forces of the British Empire will finally be deployed in a massive invasion and will deal a decisive defeat to the enemy. In 1940, this was tentatively scheduled for 1942 to 1943, but given Japan's entry into the war and a number of other factors, these timelines were hopelessly optimistic, and later on, no specific dates were even planned. The entry of the USSR and the US brought with it a more concrete focus on when and where the continental invasion would take place. However, it is important to note that this strategy was, to a certain extent, developed in isolation from these two powers, as the Soviet Union was considered an unreliable and unlikely ally, given its attacks on Finland, purges, and participation in the partition of Poland. Furthermore, a war between the USSR and Germany was highly unlikely, and while US entry into the war was highly desirable, it was impossible for Britain to base its strategy on this. In conclusion, it should be noted that Britain's strategy struck a balance between victory and survival in the war, and its revised plan can be characterized as a modernized version of the Napoleonic War strategy. Waging economic warfare at sea against a land-based enemy while fomenting revolutions in occupied countries was intended to disperse and demoralize the enemy's superior forces, preserving and building up British forces until the enemy was weakened to such an extent that Britain's relatively limited but well-trained British land forces could be deployed to deliver a crushing blow. Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. It really means a lot to us. Share your thoughts in the comments. This has been the History Moment channel. See you soon.